program that's 3 hours long. Over 40 years ago, as I explained in Plunder and Deceit, philosopher and author Ayn Rand, in her book Return of the Primitive, the Anti-Industrial Revolution, wrote presciently that the statists had changed their line of attack. She said instead of their old promises that collectivism would create universal abundance and their denunciations of capitalism for creating poverty, they are now denouncing capitalism for creating abundance. Instead of promising comfort and security for everyone, they're now denouncing people for being comfortable and secure. The demand to restrict technology is the demand to restrict man's mind. It is nature, that is reality, that makes both these goals impossible to achieve. Technology can be destroyed and the mind can be paralyzed, but neither can be restricted. Whether and wherever such restrictions are attempted, it is the mind, not the state, that withers away. Now look around the world and you know what she's talking about. She went on, to restrict technology would require omniscience, a total knowledge of all the possible effects and consequences of a given development for all the potential innovators of the future. Short of some omniscience, restrictions mean the attempt to regulate the unknown, to limit the unborn, to set rules for the undiscovered. A stagnant technology is the equivalent of a stagnant mind. A restricted technology is the equivalent of a censored mind. Now, when you think about this, how brilliant she was. What is capitalism? What are free markets? They're freedom. Freedom of what? To innovate and create. Freedom of the mind. If you're told you can't go down this road, you can't go down this road, you can't go down this road, then they shut off the creativity and the productivity and the innovation of the mind. Capitalism is about voluntary commercial activity. That's all it is. It's about individual liberty. It's about freedom of the mind, creativity, and innovation. Now, I point out that there's these de-growth-ers. That's what they used to define themselves as. You don't hear that anymore. I don't know why we don't take the language back. It's so frustrating to me. And they used to call themselves de-growth-ers. Just like all bad ideas, this was imported from Germany and much of Europe. The so-called environmental movement today has transmuted into an aggressively nefarious and primitive faction. Naomi Klein, who's somebody who the left admires, who I detest, in recent interviews, she talks about she's a fanatical anti-capitalist and so-called climate activist. She proclaimed, and I quote, "Capitalism increasingly is a discredited system because it is seen as a system that venerates greed above all else. There's a benefit to climate discussion to name a system that lots of people already have problems with for other reasons." She said, "I don't know why it is so important to save capitalism. It's a pretty battered brand. Just focusing on climate is getting us nowhere. Many, many more people recognize the need to change our economy." This is where the Green New Deal comes from. If climate can be our lens to catalyze this economic transformation that so many people need for other, even more pressing reasons, then that may be a winning combination. This economic system, she wrote, is failing the vast majority of the people. Capitalism is also waging a war on the planet's life support system. So they basically have followed her, the Pied Piper of communism, in my humble opinion. And so they've now rebranded their degrowth movement into a Green New Deal. So you have the combination of radical environmentalism and Marxism-socialism. The Green New Deal. Sounds pretty cool because they have stolen the word green. Now, this degrowth movement, that's what I've come to call it. That's what they used to call themselves. Originating in Europe, but now taking a firm hold in the United States. The degrowthers include in their ranks none other than Barack Obama. And the degrowthers define their agenda as follows, and I quote from their own documents. "Sustainable degrowth is a downscaling of production and consumption. that increases human well-being and enhances ecological conditions and equity on the planet. It calls for a future where societies live within their ecological means, with open, localized economies and resources more equally distributed through new forms of democratic institutions. It's Marxism. They go on, it's an essential economic strategy to pursue in overdeveloped countries like the United States. See, we're overdeveloped. For the well-being of the planet, of underdeveloped populations, and yes, even of the sick, stressed, and overweight consumer populations of overdeveloped countries. Their phrases work their way into the mainstream via the media, via the Democrat Party. So we're an overdeveloped country. Now, when you overdevelop, you got to deal with it, right? For its proponents and adherents, I write, degrowth has quickly developed into a pseudo-religion and public policy obsession. In fact, the degrowthers insist their ideology reaches far beyond the environment or even its odium for capitalism and is an all-encompassing lifestyle and governing philosophy. Some of its leading advocates argue that, quote, degrowth is not just an economic concept. We shall show that it is a frame constituted by a large array of concerns, goals, strategies, and actions. And as a result, degrowth has now become a confluence point where streams of critical ideas and political action converge. Degrowth is an interpretive frame for a social movement, understood as the mechanism through which actors engage in a collective action. I'm just quoting their documents. Now, the degrowthers seek to eliminate carbon sources of energy. And you've heard AOC go on about we need to eliminate this in 12 years. And redistribute wealth according to terms they consider equitable. They reject the traditional economic reality that acknowledges growth as improving living conditions generally, but especially for the impoverished. They embrace the notions of less competition, large-scale redistribution, sharing, and reduction of excessive incomes and wealth. Degrowthers want to engage in policies that will set, quote, a maximum income or maximum wealth, I quote them, to weaken envy as a motor of consumerism, and open borders, no borders, to reduce means to keep inequality between rich and poor countries. Do you better understand what I'm talking about here? It's not an environmental movement. It's a Marxist movement to control the economy and to eliminate the borders. Now you see the resistance in building a wall. Because they work. Goes further. And they demand reparations by supporting a, quote, concept of ecological debt, or the demand that the global north, that would be us, pays for past and present colonial exploitation in the global south, quote, unquote. You want to hear more? This is who they are. McConnell has no idea what's going on. McCarthy has no idea what's going on. These freaks are running circles around them. French economist and leading degrowther Serge Latouche, I could say something, but I won't, asserts that, quote, we are currently witnessing the steady commercialization of everything in the world. Applied to every domain in this way, capitalism cannot help but destroy the planet much as it destroys society, since the very idea of the market depends on unlimited excess and domination. He also abhors economic growth and wealth creation, the very attributes necessary to improve the human condition in societies. He said a society based on economic contraction cannot exist under capitalism. So we are overdeveloped. We need economic contraction. And indeed, on July 18, 2014, 4.5 years ago, scores of extreme groups throughout the world endorsed a proclamation titled, in English, Climate Change. Subtitled, Changing the System, Not the Climate, which calls for, among other things, an end to the capitalist hegemonic system. Degrowth is, they write, usually characterized by a strong utopian dimension. Its foundations rely on a version of economic relations based on sharing, gifts, reciprocity, where social relations and conviviality are central. Now, to implement this utopian vision of radical egalitarian outcomes, the degrowth movement employs strategies such as, quote, alternative building, opposition, and research. And in relation to capitalism, they can be anti-capitalist, post-capitalist, and despite capitalism. The degrowthers insist that governments establish a living wage and reduce the work week to 20 hours. You'll see these proposals or something similar to it happening soon. On the living wage, you've already heard that there ought to be a minimum income for every person. It comes out of this movement. This Marxist movement dressed up as an environmental movement. A Green New Deal. Apparently discounting the fact that the population of the globe has increased by several billion human beings in the intervening years, they call for bringing, quote, material production back down to the levels of the 60s and 70s and returning to small-scale farming. Gee whiz, Mao would be proud. And degrowthers, quote, decree a moratorium on technological innovation pending an in-depth assessment of its achievement and reorientation of scientific and technical research according to new aspirations. Imagine the power and breadth of the police state necessary to enforce this form of autocracy, ladies and gentlemen. Well, we don't need to look far. In 1848, in the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels declared in part, the bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society. Constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all earlier ones. We're all bourgeoisie, you see. All fixed, fast-frozen relations, with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions, are swept away. All new-formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air, and all that is holy is profaned. And man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. The need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over to the whole surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. And this, you see, is persuasive to the knuckleheads. This is the degrowth, the anti-industrial revolution movement. The degrowthers would deindustrialize advanced economies, destroy modernity, and turn plenty into scarcity. As utopian statists, degrowthers reject experience, knowledge, and science for a paradisiacal abstraction, while claiming to have mastered them all. Ultimately, for the more fanatical among them, the ultimate purpose is revolution and transformation. The environment is incidental, if not extraneous, to their central mission, except as a cunning stratagem. Most Americans do not wish to throw themselves into a regressive primal lifestyle. They enjoy the abundance of untold human benefits and improvements resulting from entrepreneurship, capitalism, and economic growth. So the degrowth movement has attempted to conceal its pagan-like militant opposition to fossil fuels and carbon dioxide by mainstreaming its agenda with politically generated and well-funded campaigns. Hey, Green New Deal! Promoting what was once called man-made global cooling, then man-made global warming, and now man-made climate change. Nonetheless, like most dogmatists, the degrowthers are impatient. The revolution is now, and change must be immediate. Thus, the degrowthers' agenda is built around hysterical doomsday predictions of environmental Armageddon, which can only be avoided by the imposition of their severe, ideologically driven agenda. That is exactly what's taking place. This book was written how many years ago? Not that long ago, 2015. Well, here it is, front and center. I'll be right back.
Mark Levin.
Mark, what you're telling us is so depressing. No, what I'm telling you is taking place. And we need to be informed about what's taking place. That's why I'm telling you. There's a reason these things are happening. They don't just happen. There's a reason for this. And there's a reason why the Republicans are not prepared or simply do not want to engage. We're up against a force in this country that other societies have confronted too, except in the case of our country, it's been so successful. We're so large. We have so many people that they've taken a different tack. And it's a more diabolical tack. They are using our institutions against us. They are using our institutions against us. They're using liberty to promote their form of tyranny. This is a big deal, isn't it? That's what's taking place. And unfortunately, most of these people in politics on the Republican side don't get it. They don't get it. But now you get it. So when you hear these phrases that all of a sudden pop up, they didn't come out of nowhere. The Green New Deal, trying to figure out how best to market their tyranny. A right to health care. Yeah, like at the VA and Medicaid, a right to health care. You have a right to lousy care or no care under their system. Everybody has a right to crap. Now, in Venezuela, you have a right to toilet paper. Problem is, there is no toilet paper. In Venezuela, you have a right to eat at a fair price. Problem is, there's no food. In Venezuela, right? You have a right to free college. The problem is nobody's going to college right now in Venezuela. I don't know how many human disasters, human experiments we need with this ideology in one form or another to wake us the hell up. Why would you trade this country, this society, this economic system for what a few jerks are out there peddling? And why aren't there enough people who can confront them and say these things?